The deafening crack of gunfire echoed through the dusty Wyoming plains as Emma Richardson clutched her two young children closer to her frail body, the last remnants of hope draining from her hollow eyes. Spring of 1873 had brought nothing but heartache to the young widow, whose husband's grave was still fresh on the rocky hillside behind their dilapidated homestead. Her pantry was empty, save for a handful of dried beans and some moldy flour. Her children's once rosy cheeks had grown gaunt, their energy depleted from months of insufficient meals. As Emma made the desperate decision to surrender her children to the Reverend in Sweetwater Junction, fate intervened in the form of a broad-shouldered cowboy with weathered skin and kind eyes. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched Wyoming plains as Emma Richardson stood before the small wooden cross marking her husband's grave, the wind tugging at her threadbare dress and whipping strands of once lustrous brown hair across her hollow-cheeked face, and she pressed her cracked lips together to hold back the tears that would waste precious moisture her body could no longer afford to lose. Behind her, the dilapidated homestead that had once held so much promise now stood as a monument to crushed dreams, its garden withered under the relentless drought, its pantry containing nothing but a handful of dried beans and moldy flour that she had been stretching for weeks, mixing with whatever wild greens she could forage to create watery soups that did little to fill the gnawing emptiness in her children's bellies. Emma's decision had not come easily. Each sleepless night spent wrestling with the impossible choice, until the sight of 6-year-old Sarah's once plump cheeks grown gaunt and 4-year-old Jacob's listless gaze had finally forced her hand. Better her children live apart from her than starve before her eyes. That morning, she had packed their few belongings into a small cloth sack, washed their faces with water carefully rationed from their dwindling well, and dressed them in their least patched clothing before telling them with forced brightness, "We're going on a journey to Sweetwater Junction," careful to keep the tremor from her voice as she knelt before them and straightened Jacob's frayed collar, knowing that the Reverend there sometimes found homes for children whose parents could no longer care for them. The 10-mile walk to town stretched before them like an eternity, but Emma squared her shoulders with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through 7 months of widowhood, through burying the husband she had loved since she was 17, through the rejection of her wealthy Pennsylvania family who had disowned her for marrying beneath her station, through the betrayal of her own body that had grown too weak from hunger to properly tend their land. "Come along now," she said with a final glance at Thomas's grave, silently promising him that she would ensure their children's survival even if it broke her heart into more pieces than she could ever gather again. And with that, she took each child by the hand and began the long trek eastward beneath the unforgiving midday sun. By mid-afternoon, Jacob's worn-through boots had rubbed blisters on his small feet, forcing Emma to carry him despite her own fatigue, his slight weight still almost more than her weakened arms could bear as she trudged onward, one foot before the other, while Sarah walked silently beside her, occasionally stopping to pick wildflowers that somehow managed to bloom defiantly from the cracked earth. "Mama, I'm hungry," Jacob whimpered against her neck as they paused in the meager shade of a stunted cottonwood, and Emma swallowed hard, past the lump in her throat, having nothing to offer him but empty promises. "We'll have something soon, sweetheart." Words that tasted like ash on her tongue as she pressed a kiss to his dusty forehead and adjusted his weight in her aching arms. Sarah looked up at her with eyes too, knowing for a child so young, her small hand reaching up to pat Emma's arm in a gesture so adult that it nearly shattered Emma's fragile composure. "It's all right, Mama," the little girl whispered. "I can wait." And in that moment Emma feared her heart might simply stop beating from the mixture of pride and sorrow that flooded her chest. They had covered perhaps 7 miles, still 3 miles from Sweetwater Junction, when Emma's sharp eyes caught the telltale sign of dust rising on the horizon, and her body tensed with the instinctive wariness that frontier life had instilled in her. For in these parts, strangers could mean many things, most of them dangerous for a woman alone with 2 small children. "Come behind me," she instructed, setting Jacob down and pushing both children behind her skirts as she squinted into the distance, watching as the dust cloud resolved into the silhouette of a single rider approaching at a steady pace. Her hand went unconsciously to the small knife tucked in her pocket, Thomas's knife, the last gift he had given her before pneumonia had taken him. knowing it would provide little protection but unwilling to face whatever came without some means of defending her children. As the rider drew closer, Emma could make out the broad-shouldered frame of a man atop a muscular chestnut stallion, his face shadowed beneath the wide brim of a well-worn hat, and she straightened to her full height, summoning dignity from some deep reserve that hunger and exhaustion had not yet depleted. Preston Quincy had been driving cattle from Texas to Montana with 15 other men when he'd broken away from the herd to scout ahead for water, the scorching summer having dried up many of the usual watering holes along their route, and at 32, he was experienced enough to know that finding water soon was crucial for the 2,000 head of cattle under their care. Years on the trail had weathered his skin to leather and sharpened his senses to notice details that less seasoned men might miss. So when he spotted the small family on the dusty road ahead, he immediately took in the woman's protective stance, the children's gaunt faces, and the desperate circumstances written in every line of their posture. Preston slowed his horse well before reaching them and removed his hat in a gesture of respect, revealing sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of the sky after a storm as he called out, "Good day, ma'am," in a voice deliberately pitched to sound unthreatening. Years of encountering the wariness of settlers having taught him how to approach without causing alarm. "Name's Preston Quincy. Bound for Montana with a cattle drive," he continued, keeping his stallion at a respectful distance. "Might I ask if you folks are headed somewhere?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice coming out steadier than she felt as she replied, "Sweetwater Junction, Mr. Quincy," her chin lifting slightly as she added, "We're fine. Thank you," though the slight tremor in her hands and the hollow cheeks of her children told a different story that Preston's experienced eyes could not miss. "That's still a fair piece, ma'am," he observed mildly, noting how the little boy swayed with exhaustion behind his mother's skirts, and how the woman's shoulders strained with the effort of standing tall. "I'd be happy to give the little ones a ride, if you'd allow it." And when Emma stiffened, pride warring with necessity, he added quickly, "No charity intended, ma'am, just common courtesy." Before Emma could respond, Jacob's stomach growled loudly enough for Preston to hear, and the cowboy reached unhurriedly into his saddlebag, his movements deliberately slow and non-threatening as he withdrew a cloth-wrapped package. "I've got some jerky and hardtack here," he offered. "Not much of a meal, but it'll keep the strength up." And at the mention of food, both children looked up with such naked hope that Emma felt her carefully constructed resolve begin to crumble. "That's very kind. Thank you," she finally said softly, accepting the package with hands that shook slightly from hunger and fatigue, and as she unwrapped it to reveal strips of dried beef and thick squares of hardtack, she carefully broke off small pieces for each child, warning them gently, "Slowly now, small bites," knowing their empty stomachs might rebel against too much food consumed too quickly. Preston dismounted with the easy grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the saddle than out of it, keeping a respectful distance as he asked, "Might I water my horse while the little ones eat?" And when Emma nodded her permission, he led the stallion a few paces away, giving the family privacy while keeping them in his peripheral vision, as the children ate with careful restraint that spoke volumes about their prolonged hunger. Preston casually asked about their journey, and bit by bit, Emma found herself sharing fragments of their story, that she was Emma Richardson, widow of 7 months, that drought had destroyed her crops, that her nearest neighbor was 15 miles away, too far to seek regular help. "Where's your family, Mrs. Richardson?" Preston asked gently, and Emma's voice flattened as she replied, "Back east, in Pennsylvania. They disowned me when I married Thomas. He was beneath my station, according to my father." The lack of self-pity in her tone earning Preston's quiet respect as he nodded in understanding, his own father having never forgiven him for choosing the open range over the family banking business in Boston. Watching as the children's faces regained a hint of animation with food in their bellies, Preston hesitated before asking the question whose answer he already suspected. "And what takes you to Sweetwater Junction today?" Emma glanced at her children, making sure they were distracted with their meal before she spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to their ears. "The Reverend there. I've heard he sometimes finds homes for children who—" Her voice broke, and she turned away, shoulders shaking silently with suppressed emotion. Something twisted in Preston's chest as he witnessed her quiet dignity in the face of such an impossible choice, and before he could reconsider, he heard himself saying, "Mrs. Richardson, I'm headed to a ranch about 20 miles north of here. Man named Holbrook is looking for a cook and housekeeper. Pays fair, and there's a cabin for workers with families." And when hope flickered briefly in Emma's eyes before dying, he pressed on. "Holbrook's different. His wife died last winter. Place needs a woman's touch, and I reckon he'd welcome some young ones around. Makes a place feel like home." Emma studied his face for long moments, searching for any sign of deceit as she voiced the doubts that immediately surfaced. "I can't cook anything fancy, Mr. Quincy. And these two," she gestured toward her children, "they need watching. No ranch foreman wants the burden of children underfoot." But Preston insisted. "Holbrook's different," with a certainty that made Emma pause. Still, suspicion born of hard experience made her ask, "Why would you help us?" "You don't know me." And Preston looked down at his boots before meeting her gaze directly, something raw and honest in his expression as he answered, "My ma died when I was 8. Drought year, like this one. Pa couldn't manage alone with 4 young ones. He gave my youngest sister away to cousins back east." The pain in his voice still fresh despite the passage of years as he added quietly, "Never saw her again." Emma's hand flew to her mouth, compassion momentarily overwhelming her caution as she whispered, "I'm so sorry." And Preston nodded once, sharply. "So am I, ma'am. So am I. Now will you let me help you and these young ones?" As Emma looked at her children, now dozing against each other in the sparse shade, their small bodies finally relaxed with the temporary relief of food in their bellies, she found herself at a crossroads that would determine all their futures. To continue to Sweetwater Junction and surrender her children to separate fates, or to trust this stranger with weather-worn hands and eyes that held their own share of sorrow. "What if Mr. Holbrook doesn't want us?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear, and Preston's steady gaze held hers as he answered, "Then I'll find you something else. You have my word, ma'am. Those children won't be separated, not while I draw a breath." And something in his quiet conviction reached past Emma's carefully constructed defenses, touching the part of her that desperately wanted to believe that not all hope was lost. Drawing a deep breath, Emma made her decision, nodding once as she said simply, "Thank you, Mr. Quincy. We accept your help." The words nearly catching in her throat as relief and trepidation warred within her chest. Preston's face softened with the ghost of a smile as he replied, "Good. We'll rest here a bit longer, then be on our way." And as he turned to check his horse's saddle, Emma found herself watching the straight line of his shoulders, wondering at the strange twist of fate that had brought this man to their path on this of all days, when desperation had driven her to a choice no mother should ever have to make. The sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the parched landscape as Preston helped Emma settle the still drowsy children on his horse. Sarah perched in front of him while Jacob rode in Emma's arms as she sat behind, the steady rhythm of the stallion's gait lulling the exhausted children back to sleep as they began the journey northward, away from the road to Sweetwater Junction that had nearly led to the fracturing of their small family. Emma's arms tightened protectively around Jacob as she whispered a silent prayer of gratitude to whatever Providence had sent Preston Quincy to intercept them on their desperate journey, allowing herself, for the first time since Thomas's death, to feel the faintest stirring of what might, with cautious nurturing, eventually grow into hope. The journey to Holbrook's ranch took the remainder of that day and part of the next, with Preston's chestnut stallion carrying them at a steady pace across the rolling Wyoming landscape, stopping occasionally at small creeks where water still flowed in thin ribbons through the parched earth. And Emma marveled at how the cowboy seemed to know exactly where to find these precious resources hidden in the seemingly barren terrain. Preston proved himself to be a man of few words but considerable thoughtfulness, making sure they stopped frequently enough for the children's comfort without Emma having to ask, fashioning a small sunshade from his spare bandana to protect Jacob's fair skin from the relentless summer sun, and sharing stories of his cattle drives that had Sarah wide-eyed with wonder, tales carefully chosen to entertain rather than frighten, Emma noted, watching how her daughter's hand crept trustingly into Preston's calloused one as they rested in the shade of a cottonwood grove. Despite her exhaustion, Emma found herself studying the cowboy when he wasn't looking, noting the gentle way he lifted the children on and off the horse, how his weathered face softened when Sarah asked her endless questions, the quiet competence in his movements that spoke of a man who had faced the harshness of the frontier and emerged neither broken nor cruel, a rarity in these unforgiving lands where Emma had seen too many men twisted by hardship into shadows of their former selves. "How much further?" she asked as they made camp for the night, her voice betraying more anxiety than she had intended to reveal, and Preston pointed north to a distant ridge barely visible in the fading light. "Just beyond there. We'll reach it by mid-morning tomorrow, God willing," his tone carrying a certainty that somehow eased the knot of tension between Emma's shoulders, even as another part of her remained wary of allowing hope to take root too deeply. That night, after the children had fallen asleep beneath Preston's heavy trail blanket, Emma sat across the small campfire from him, the dancing flames illuminating his features in flickering gold, as he explained more about Hallbrook and the ranch they were heading toward. "He's a fair man. Lost his wife to fever last winter. Has about 2,000 acres. Runs 500 head of cattle with 8 hired hands. The house needs a woman's touch, something fierce. Been nothing but men there since Mrs. Hallbrook passed." And when Emma expressed doubt about her qualifications, Preston merely said, "You've kept 2 young ones alive through drought and widowhood, Mrs. Richardson. I reckon that makes you more qualified than most." The simple statement acknowledging her strength in a way few ever had. As dawn broke the following morning, painting the eastern sky in streaks of pink and gold, Emma woke to find Preston already up, brewing coffee over a small fire and cooking a thin porridge that smelled better than anything she had eaten in months. And the normalcy of the scene, a man preparing breakfast while her children slept peacefully nearby, struck her with an unexpected wave of longing so powerful it nearly took her breath away. By mid-morning, just as Preston had predicted, they crested a gentle rise to reveal Hallbrook's ranch spread out below them. A substantial main house built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney, several outbuildings including a barn larger than any Emma had ever seen, corrals containing horses, and beyond them, the vast expanse of grazing land where cattle dotted the landscape like dark specks against the golden grass. Emma felt her heart racing with equal parts hope and fear as they approached, unconsciously straightening her threadbare dress and smoothing Sarah's tangled hair, whispering urgently to both children, "Best behavior now. Remember your manners." While Preston watched with a hint of understanding in his eyes, having witnessed this same mixture of pride and desperation in his own mother years ago, Ephraim Hallbrook proved to be a stern-faced man in his 50s with silver-streaked dark hair and penetrating eyes that assessed Emma and her children with unsettling thoroughness before he nodded once at Preston's explanation of their situation and said simply, "The east cabin needs cleaning, but it's yours if you want it. Meals for the hands 3 times daily, laundry once a week, house cleaning as needed. Pay is $15 monthly plus your keep. Children can stay if they don't interfere with the work." His tone matter-of-fact rather than unkind, though Emma had to fight to keep her knees from buckling at this unexpected reprieve from the fate that had nearly claimed her family. The cabin, though dusty from disuse, was larger than the room Emma and her children had shared in their failed homestead, containing 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen area with a cook stove, a table with 4 chairs, and best of all, a pump that delivered clear, cold water right inside, a luxury Emma had never experienced and which brought tears to her eyes when Preston demonstrated it for her. "I'll be moving on with the herd tomorrow," Preston told her that evening after helping her clean the cabin and bring in supplies from the cookhouse, his tone casual though something in his eyes betrayed regret. "But I'll likely pass back this way in a month or so," and Emma found herself nodding wordlessly, suddenly unable to express the complicated mixture of gratitude and disappointment that twisted in her chest at the thought of his departure. True to his word, Preston rode out the next morning with the cattle drive, leaving behind a carefully wrapped package containing a small doll for Sarah, a wooden whistle for Jacob, and for Emma, a bar of lavender soap that struck her as an unexpectedly thoughtful gift after months of making do with harsh lie. Life at Hallbrook's ranch quickly established its own rhythm, with Emma rising before dawn to start breakfast for the ranch hands, 8 men, of varying ages who initially regarded her with the awkward wariness of those long unaccustomed to female company but who soon came to appreciate her quiet efficiency and the marked improvement in their meals. Despite her initial insecurities, Emma discovered that cooking for the ranch was not so different from cooking for her own family, merely on a larger scale. And Holbrook himself grudgingly acknowledged her competence after the first week, with an increase in supplies that allowed her to bake bread and pies that earned her the undying loyalty of the cowhands. The children, too, began to thrive in their new environment. Sarah helping Emma with simple tasks and Jacob following the ranch hands around with worshipful eyes, until one grizzled old cowboy named Hank took it upon himself to teach the boy how to feed the bride, chickens, and collect eggs, tasks that gave the 4-year-old a sense of importance that straightened his once stooped shoulders. As weeks passed, Emma noticed her own reflection changing in the small mirror hanging in her cabin. Her face filling out as regular meals restored what hunger had stolen, her eyes losing some of their haunted look, her hands still work-roughened but no longer trembling with constant fatigue. Exactly 1 month after he had left, Preston Quincy rode back into Holbrook's ranch, his arrival spotted first by Jacob, who came running to the cookhouse where Emma was preparing dinner, shouting with more animation than he'd shown in months. "Mama, Mr. Preston's back. Come see." Emma wiped her hands on her apron, telling herself that the sudden quickening of her pulse was merely surprise, rather than the pleasure that warmed her chest as she stepped outside to see Preston dismounting from his horse, trail dust coating his clothes, but a smile breaking across his weathered face as he spotted her and the children. He stayed for 2 weeks that time, helping Holbrook mend fences and move cattle to fresh pastures, and each evening he would stop by their cabin, sometimes bringing small treasures. A book of poetry that reminded Emma of her schoolgirl days, a length of bright ribbon for Sarah's hair, a small pocket knife for Jacob that made the boy stand taller with pride at being trusted with such a grown-up possession. On his 3rd evening back, Preston offered to teach Jacob how to whittle, and Emma watched from the cabin doorway as the cowboy's large hands gently guided her son's small ones, showing him how to hold the knife safely and carve simple shapes from soft pine. The boy's look of concentration and Preston's patient instruction forming a tableau that made Emma's heart ache with a bittersweet longing for what might have been if Thomas had lived, mingled with a growing warmth for this man who treated her children with such natural kindness. This pattern continued through late summer and into early autumn, Preston coming and going with cattle drives or supply runs to distant towns, each visit bringing him more firmly into their lives. And Emma found herself looking forward to his returns with an anticipation that both excited and frightened her, for to care for another man seemed somehow a betrayal of Thomas's memory. The first severe thunderstorm of autumn came roaring across the plains one night in late September, lightning splitting the sky and thunder shaking the cabin's sturdy walls as Emma sat bolt upright in bed, her heart pounding and sweat cold on her skin despite the chill in the air, for it had been just such a night when Thomas had fallen ill with the pneumonia that would claim his life. 3 days of raging fever while rain lashed their small homestead, and she had been powerless to save him. Unable to banish the memories that assaulted her, Emma wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped onto the cabin's small porch, hoping the fresh air might clear her mind even as rain soaked her within moments. She didn't hear Preston's approach over the storm's fury, only becoming aware of his presence when he spoke her name with quiet concern, having seen her silhouette from the bunkhouse where he was staying during this visit. "Thomas died on a night like this," she found herself confessing, the words torn from her by some need greater than her usual reserve. "I couldn't save him. I tried everything I knew, but I couldn't save him." And to her horror, a sob escaped her throat, the first time she had truly cried since the day she had buried her husband, having been too focused on survival to allow herself the luxury of grief. Without a word, Preston stepped closer, offering his presence without demanding anything in return, and something in his quiet strength broke the last of Emma's carefully constructed barriers as she whispered brokenly, "I'm so tired of being strong," a confession she had never dared make to anyone. "Then let someone else be strong for a while," Preston said simply, and when another crack of thunder made Emma flinch, he gently drew her against his chest, sheltering her from the rain with his body as she finally allowed herself to weep for all she had lost, for the desperate choices she had nearly made, for the fear that still haunted her that this reprieve might prove temporary. They stood there until the storm began to abate, neither speaking but something profound shifting between them in that shared silence. And when Emma finally stepped back, wiping her eyes with embarrassment, Preston simply said, "We've all got storms inside us, Emma. No shame in letting them out. Sometimes." The use of her given name passing unremarked between them, though its intimacy warmed her despite her rain-soaked clothes. The following evening, after the children were asleep, Preston and Emma sat at her small table drinking coffee, and in the soft lamplight, she found herself sharing stories of Thomas, good memories that had been overshadowed by the pain of his loss, while Preston in turn spoke of his mother's death and the guilt he still carried for not fighting harder when his father gave away his little sister. "Do you think we ever really heal from such losses?" Emma asked softly, and Preston considered the question with the thoughtfulness she had come to value in him before answering. "Not heal, exactly. But maybe we learn to carry them differently. Less like an open wound. More like a scar that changes us but doesn't cripple us." His words touching something deep within Emma that recognized their truth. In the days that followed, Emma became aware of a subtle shift in her feelings toward Preston, no longer seeing him merely as her family's rescuer, but as a man whose quiet strength and gentle humor had begun to weave itself into the fabric of her daily thoughts, whose visits brought a lightness to her step that the ranch hands noticed with knowing glances, whose absence left a space that grew more difficult to ignore with each departure. Yet with this awareness came guilt that twisted like a knife whenever she caught herself watching for Preston's return or taking extra care with her appearance before he arrived. For loving another man felt like erasing Thomas, betraying the vows she had made and the life they had built together. "Mrs. Richardson," Holbrook said to her one evening as she cleared away the dinner dishes, his usually gruff voice almost gentle. "My Margaret would have liked you. Strong woman, like yourself." And when Emma murmured polite thanks, unsure where this unprecedented personal comment was leading, the rancher continued, "She'd also have boxed my ears if I'd spent my life alone after she passed. Said as much before she went. 'Ephraim,' she told me, 'you find another good woman when I'm gone. Life's too long for solitary living.'" The unexpected insight into his own loss leaving Emma speechless, as Holbrook nodded once as if having completed an uncomfortable duty, and returned to his account books. That night, Emma stood at her cabin window looking out at the star-filled sky, Thomas's face clear in her memory as she whispered, "Would you want that for me too? To find happiness again?" And though no answer came from the silent stars, she felt something loosen in her chest, a permission she had been unable to grant herself beginning to take tentative root in soil long barren of hope. When Preston returned from his next cattle drive bearing gifts as usual, this time a shawl of soft blue wool for Emma that must have cost more than he could easily afford, she accepted it with a smile that held none of her former reserve. And as their fingers brushed in the exchange, the connection between them hummed with unspoken possibility. Two souls that had known profound loss, recognizing in each other the courage to hope again. The golden-red leaves of autumn carpeted Holbrook's ranch as October brought crisp mornings and earlier sunsets, the changing season mirroring the transformation in Emma's life as Preston's visits became more frequent and his departures increasingly difficult for all of them, especially the children who would watch the horizon for days after he left, eager for the first glimpse of his return. It was during one such homecoming, as Preston rode in with the last cattle herd before winter, that Holbrook approached him with an unexpected proposition, a permanent position overseeing the ranch's expanding herd, complete with a raise in pay and greater responsibilities, an offer that brought a look of such barely contained joy to Preston's normally composed features that Emma felt her own heart quicken at the implications of what its permanent presence might mean for their future. That evening, as they sat on her cabin porch watching the children chase fireflies in the deepening twilight, Preston shared the news, his voice carefully neutral, though his eyes searched Emma's face for her reaction as he explained, "Holbrook wants me to help him expand the herd come spring. Says the operation's growing too big for him to manage alone." And when Emma responded with genuine pleasure, "That's wonderful news, Preston. The children will be overjoyed," he asked quietly. "And you, Emma? How do you feel about it?" The question laden with meaning that hung between them in the cool autumn air until she met his gaze directly and answered simply, "I'm overjoyed as well," the admission finally giving voice to the feelings that had been growing between them through the changing seasons of their acquaintance. The weeks that followed brought a gentle shift in their relationship, fingers touching a moment longer than necessary when passing a cup of coffee, Quiet conversations stretching late into the evening after the children were asleep. Shared glances that communicated more than words could express. And Emma found herself rediscovering parts of herself long dormant, the young woman who had once defied her wealthy family to marry for love emerging from beneath layers of grief and hardship. Sarah and Jacob, too, blossomed under Preston's steady presence. The little girl asking him to braid her hair the way Papa used to do, the boy trailing him from barn to corral, solemnly mimicking his movements and storing up his words like treasures. And Emma watched this natural bond forming with a bittersweet happiness, grateful that her children had found such a figure in their lives, yet sometimes catching herself wondering if Thomas would understand, would approve of this man who was slowly filling the emptiness he had left behind. The first real test of Preston's commitment came unexpectedly when Jacob fell ill with a fever in mid-November, the boy's small body burning with heat one night, as Emma applied cold compresses and whispered desperate prayers. The terror of possibly losing another loved one nearly paralyzing her until Preston arrived, taking in the situation with one glance and immediately dispatching a ranch hand to fetch the doctor from Sweetwater Junction. "He'll be all right, Emma," Preston assured her with a certainty she desperately needed to hear, though the worry in his eyes betrayed his own fear as he gently lifted Jacob's limp form to help Emma change the sweat-soaked bedding. "He's strong, like his mother." And for the next 3 days and nights, Preston remained in the cabin, spelling Emma so she could rest, reading stories to distract Sarah from her worry, and most remarkably, sitting hour after hour beside Jacob's sickbed, bathing the boy's feverish brow and speaking to him in low, encouraging tones about future fishing trips and the pony he would teach him to ride when spring came, watching Preston's unshaven face in the lamplight as he dozed in the chair beside Jacob's bed, unwilling to leave even for his own rest. Emma felt the last of her reservations about loving this man dissolve into certainty. This was no passing affection or mere gratitude, but something profound and enduring that had grown quietly between them through shared hardship and joy. When Jacob's fever finally broke on the 4th day, Preston's exhausted face lit with such profound relief that Emma impulsively reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally as they watched the boy's peaceful sleep, the touch communicating everything neither yet had the courage to say aloud. As December arrived with its bitter cold and pristine snowfalls, the ranch settled into its winter rhythm. Cattle brought closer to the main buildings for easier feeding, extra firewood stacked against cabin walls, preparations made for the long months of relative isolation that lay ahead. And with Christmas approaching, a festive atmosphere gradually spread across the ranch despite the harsh weather, with Emma teaching the children to make paper decorations and Preston returning from a supply run to Cheyenne with small gifts secreted in his saddlebags. 2 days before Christmas, with the afternoon sun casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Preston asked Emma to walk with him to the frozen creek behind the cabin, his manner uncharacteristically nervous as he helped her don her heavy coat and wrapped an extra scarf around her neck against the biting cold. They walked in companionable silence, their breath forming clouds in the crisp air, until they reached a bend in the creek where ice had formed fantastic crystalline sculptures along the banks, the setting sun transforming them into structures of gold and rose that took Emma's breath away. "I've been thinking about the future, Emma," Preston said finally, his deep voice unusually hesitant as he turned to face her. "About what I want my life to be." And Emma felt her heart quicken, her cheeks flushing pink not merely from the cold as he continued. "When I found you and the children on that dusty road, I was still a drifter at heart, never stayed anywhere long enough to put down roots. Always thought the next horizon might hold whatever I was looking for." His eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Turns out what I was looking for was right here all along, not in some distant place, but in a family I never expected to find." Taking her gloved hands in his, Preston spoke the words Emma had both longed for and feared. "Emma, I know it's only been a short while, and if you need more time, I understand. But I love you. I love your children. I want us to be a family." And when tears filled Emma's eyes, freezing almost instantly on her lashes in the bitter cold, he quickly added, "Before you answer, there's something you should know. I'm not asking you to forget Thomas. He'll always be part of you, part of the children. I would never want to change that." The understanding in his words unlocking the final barrier around Emma's heart. "Thomas would have liked you. she said softly, squeezing his hands. He would have approved of the man who's stolen my heart. And Preston's face lit with hope as he asked, "Does that mean yes?" "Yes," Emma whispered, her voice growing stronger as joy spread through her like warmth. "Yes, I'll marry you, Preston Quincy." And when he pulled her into an embrace, lifting her feet clear off the snowy ground in his enthusiasm, she laughed aloud, a sound so unexpected and long absent that it startled them both before Preston joined in, their shared happiness echoing across the winter landscape as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of promise. Their wedding was held on New Year's Day, 1874, in the Hallbrook Ranch house where the gruff rancher had insisted the ceremony take place, rather than cramming everyone into that tiny cabin, revealing a sentimental streak few had suspected beneath his stern exterior. Reverend Walsh rode out from Sweetwater Junction to perform the ceremony despite the winter roads, having been moved by Preston's account of nearly intercepting Emma on her desperate journey to give up her children months before. Sarah scattered pine needles instead of flower petals, her face solemn with the importance of her role until she caught Preston's wink and broke into a radiant smile that transformed her into the carefree child she was meant to be. Jacob carried the simple gold band Preston had purchased from a jeweler in Cheyenne, the boy's chest puffed with pride in his fine new suit, a miniature version of Preston's own, as he solemnly fulfilled his duty. As they exchanged vows before the crackling hearth, with ranch hands and neighbors gathered as witnesses, Emma felt Thomas's presence like a gentle benediction, a blessing on this new beginning rather than a ghost to haunt it. And she knew with certainty that she would always love him, always honor his memory. But her heart had expanded to embrace this second chance at happiness that had come in the most unexpected way. That night, after the small celebration had ended and the children were asleep in their beds, Preston and Emma stood on the porch of what was now their cabin, gazing at the star-filled sky while Preston's arms circled Emma's waist, drawing her close against the winter chill. "I never thought I'd find this," Preston confessed, his voice hushed with wonder. "A home, a family, you." And Emma leaned against him, drawing strength and warmth from his solid presence. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. Then, when the drought came and the food ran out," she shuddered at the memory before continuing. "That day on the road, I was going to give up my children rather than watch them starve. The admission still painful despite the happier ending their story had found. And instead you found the courage to trust a stranger." Preston finished for her, turning her in his arms to face him as his voice softened. "The moment you offered to take my children and then said you'd take me too, that was the moment hope returned to my life," Emma told him, her eyes shining in the starlight. Preston lowered his forehead to rest against hers. "I knew the moment I saw you standing in that dusty road, protecting your children with nothing but will and love, that you were the strongest person I'd ever met. I wanted to be worthy of that strength." And Emma's whispered response came straight from her heart. "You are. Every day in 1,000 ways, you prove it." Their kiss gentle yet profound, a promise of the life they would build together beneath the wheeling stars that witnessed another story of love forged in the crucible of the American West. A love born of desperation and kindness, tempered by loss and strengthened by hope. Spring came early that year, as if nature itself celebrated their new beginning, the land greening almost overnight as March gave way to April, wildflowers carpeting the plains in riots of color. And the Hallbrook Ranch prospered under Preston's management and Emma's efficient care of the household. With her husband's enthusiastic help, Emma planted a garden twice the size of her old one, the children joining in to tend it with far more enthusiasm than they had shown for chores in the past, giggling as Preston taught them to make perfectly straight rows and pretending not to notice when he slipped them candy from his pocket for their efforts. Sarah started school in Sweetwater Junction, riding there with Preston when he had business in town, her quick mind and sweet nature making her a favorite with the school teacher, while Jacob followed his new father everywhere, learning the ways of horses and cattle with the solemn dedication of a boy who had found his hero. The transformation in both children amazed Emma, who sometimes found herself pausing in her work to watch them through the cabin window, Sarah's once gaunt face now round with health, her laughter coming easily, Jacob's eyes bright with confidence instead of hunger, his small shoulders straight with pride as Preston taught him to help with ranch chores, And in those moments, gratitude would well up so powerfully within her that tears would blur her vision before she would shake them away and return to her tasks with renewed purpose. On a warm evening in May, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Emma took Preston's hand and placed it gently on her stomach, her eyes meeting his with mingled joy and nervousness as she said softly, "We'll need a bigger cabin by winter," and watched understanding dawn in his expression. "A baby? Truly?" Preston asked, his voice barely above a whisper, and when Emma nodded, tears shining in her eyes, he let out a whoop that startled a nearby meadowlark into flight, lifting Emma from her chair and twirling her around until they were both laughing breathlessly. Later that night, as they lay in bed with Preston's hand resting protectively over the new life growing within her, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the depths of despair on that dusty road to this perfect contentment, it seemed both an eternity and the blink of an eye. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured sleepily beside her, and Emma smiled in the darkness as she replied, "That life is strange and wonderful, that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our darkest moments," feeling Preston pull her closer as he added with drowsy humor, "And sometimes they come disguised as trail-worn cowboys," making her laugh softly. "Indeed, they do." Outside their window, the Wyoming night was alive with the sounds of spring. Frogs calling from the creek, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of new leaves in the gentle breeze. While inside, wrapped in each other's arms, Emma and Preston Quincy dreamed of the future they would build together. A future born from a desperate plea and an answer that had changed everything. "Take my children," a starving widow had said. "I'll take you too," the cowboy had answered, and in that moment, two broken lives had begun to heal, forging a love that would endure through all the seasons to come.